Welcome to the third hearing of the Public Accountability Committee's inquiry into the appointment of Mr John Barilaro as Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner to the Americas. The inquiry is examining the circumstances leading up to the appointment, including the processes and probity and integrity measures that were undertaken. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Before we commence, I would like to also make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's hearing is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. A transcript of today's hearing will be placed on the committee's website when it becomes available. In accordance with broadcasting guidelines, media representatives are reminded that they must take responsibility for what they publish about the committee's proceedings. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses may say outside of their evidence at the hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it is important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. If witnesses are unable to answer a question today and want more time to respond, they can take a question on notice. Written answers to questions taken on notice are to be provided within 21 days. If witnesses wish to hand up documents, they should do so through the committee staff. In terms of the audibility of the hearing today, I remind both committee members and witnesses to speak into the microphone. For those that have hearing difficulties who are present in the room today, please note that the room is fitted with induction loops compatible with hearing aid systems that have telecoil receivers. And finally, could everyone please turn their mobile phones to silent for the duration of the hearing. Today we'll be learning from one witness, Mr Chris Carr, who is the General Counsel of the Department of Enterprise, Investment and Trade. I thank Mr Carr for making time to give evidence to this inquiry. Mr Carr, could you please state your full name, position, title and swear either an oath or an affirmation?
My full name is Christopher Stewart Ronald Carr. My title is General Counsel of the Department of Enterprise, Investment and Trade, and I'll swear an oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Would you like to start by making a short opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. I would.
Please keep it to a couple of minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to assist this inquiry. As explained to the committee prior to my attendance today, there may be limitations on the evidence that I provide, noting that legal professional privilege and the protection of cabinet in confidence information may apply. At the outset, I want to outline my limited role in these matters and respond to inaccuracies in evidence provided so far. First, to my role. For context, I joined the New South Wales Public Service on 16 June 2021 as General Counsel of Investment New South Wales, essentially the director responsible for the very small function of a then new agency. On stick recruitments, my role was usually limited to advice on stick contracts, discussions in the final stages of the processes. As has now become clear, in mid-August 2021, the relevant portfolio minister became aware that under existing New South Wales legal framework, the stick appointments did not need to go to Cabinet for approval, and that he and others would be asked going forward to note the appointments, not approve them. I was then asked to provide advice in relation to a policy question, being, why is it that in New South Wales the law provides that these appointments go through the public service, and what would it take to change that to ministerial appointments? I understand that what happened next was through his advisors. The minister then sought that advice from the Investment New South Wales CEO in early September, who then asked me to prepare advice on that question. The advice I provided, while legal advice essentially, then formed the basis for Cabinet deliberations on policy. In relation to the matters the committee is looking into, I have 4 initial comments. 1. The instructions I received on the policy question were from a combination of the Investment New South Wales CEO and her then Chief of Staff. I was not contacted by Mr Barilaro's office to provide that advice. 2. I have never met, spoken to, nor communicated directly with Mr Joseph Brayford. My only contacts with him that I'm aware of are that I was copied on one email on 9 September 2021 that attached my initial advice, and then copied on 2 emails after 27 September 2021 to arrange a call to discuss the decision of government. That call never happened. I had only one interaction with Minister Barilaro's office during the time he was a minister. A junior advisor asked me questions on a Teams call in relation to the foreign affairs powers in the Commonwealth Constitution and a question regarding the Commonwealth's Foreign Relations Act, with her other questions having already been addressed by others. 4. I did not ever meet nor have any contact with Mr John Barilaro until finalising his contract in mid-2022, by which time he was a private citizen. I have only ever met him once via one Teams call. Similar calls have happened with other stick candidates that emerge from the selection part of the process as they get towards the end of the overall recruitment process. Those are the facts as they relate to my role. Secondly, I would like to take the opportunity to respond to evidence that has been provided on matters that are within my knowledge. The purpose is to correct the record. 1. Ms West's evidence was that her contract terms were finalised on 13 August 2021. She also stated that she was fully offered the job, her words. That is not correct. In the documents Ms West tendered, she identified material tax items that were unresolved as late as 16 September 2021. That is, in her own words, on 16 September, more than a month later, Ms West said, I need to find an expert here in US taxes that can advise me. As you will see, there are implications in many areas. And importantly, I can't move forward until this is sorted. When I received that email, I felt there were material contract terms that had not yet been finalised, particularly as to tax. In my experience, tax issues usually have cost implications that individuals seek to negotiate. Further and relevantly, because of matters related to Investment New South Wales's US structure, Investment New South Wales was not in a position to issue any contract or offer to any candidate prior to mid-December 2021. Until the agency signs an agreement, countersigned by an applicant, a person remains an applicant. My understanding is that Ms West was well advanced in the process, but not at the end of it. 2. Ms West said that Investment New South Wales did not communicate with her and that she heard nothing. From when she spoke with the Investment New South Wales CEO on 14 October 2021 until her termination letter dated 19 November 2021. That is not correct and could create the perception of an uncaring public service. Investment New South Wales received letters from Ms West's lawyers as early as 19 October 2021. Investment New South Wales had responded by 22 October 2021 and continued to correspond through lawyers throughout that time, including on such things as porting telephone numbers, leave arrangements, etc. As early as 28 October 2021, Investment New South Wales sought confirmation from Ms West's lawyers for her preferred method of correspondence regarding an intention to terminate. Finally, after repeated attempts to confirm this, Ms West's lawyers wrote on 2 November 2021 confirming that Investment New South Wales should communicate through them rather than to Ms West directly. Investment New South Wales respected and adhered faithfully to that request. 3. Ms West gave evidence that she was not given a chance to explain her situation. Ms West was asked whether she was given an opportunity to make a submission to Secretary Coates-Trotter, to which she replied no. That is not correct. On 8 November 2021, Secretary Coates-Trotter provided an intention to terminate letter to Investment New South Wales, which was then provided to Ms West's lawyers. That is, the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, who was the only person who could terminate Ms West's employment, wrote to Ms West where she specifically asked if she would like to make any submissions in relation to her Deputy Secretary role becoming redundant. It is therefore my understanding of those events that Investment New South Wales afforded Ms West customary procedural fairness on her termination. 4. Ms West said she was unaware that she could reapply for the Stick America's role. I've seen reports saying that she was somehow barred or prevented from applying for the Stick America's role when it was re-advertised. Ms West was clearly informed at the time that if she was successful in securing re-employment in the public sector, the termination payments she received could be required to be paid back pro rata. These matters were explained in Ms West's termination correspondence from the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, dated 19 November 2021. Ms West's decision to not apply is therefore a matter for her. With that in mind, and mindful of the potential limitations that may apply to my evidence today, I'm open to assist the committee to the extent that I am able to.
Questions?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr Carr, for your appearance today. We appreciate your time as well. Can I just start by asking, you are the General Counsel of the Department of Enterprise, Investment and Trade, correct?
I am now, yes, but
When were you appointed to that role?
I was appointed as an acting General Counsel on or about the 31st of January 2022.
Yep.
A recruitment process, including advertising, the normal processes for a role like that was then gone through, and I was appointed. I couldn't pin the date of it, but it would be some point around April, I think.
And
But I was
prior
appointed.
to that, you were the General Counsel of Investment New South Wales, correct?
Immediately prior, yes, I was the General Counsel. I mean, the timeline we're talking about is Christmas, so there may have been some time I was on leave and somebody else was acting.
You started that role from, you said in your opening statement, from June?
June 2021.
And how were you appointed to that role?
I applied online through through I Work for New South Wales, and
Great. And who do you answer to?
I answer to, well, ultimately I answer to the Secretary, but I also have a line manager, which is the Deputy Secretary for Engagement Operations and
And when you were the General Counsel of Investment New South Wales, did you report directly to the CEO?
No, I didn't. I reported to the Chief Operating Officer,
Who was?
who's Lisa Braid.
Okay, and through that, you were, Ms Braid was responsible for imparting views to the CEO?
I don't think that's how these things typically work, Mr Mookie. She was my manager, as she was responsible for the operations of Investment New South Wales. The legal function, as you can appreciate, is part of the operations function, but in terms of the giving or...
That's okay, I understand, Mr.
Okay.
But you were a member of the Program Steering Committee that was responsible for the rollout of the Global New South Wales Network, were you not?
That steering committee, which I think, from my recollection, I'm looking at who's listed on there, that they may have had one meeting, or maybe
Can
two.
I just table this now formally, Chair, the attendant bundle, because I think the witness is making reference to it.
Sure.
But if you turn to page 2
Yes.
of it, this is this is from a July production to the Parliament. As in, sorry, the production was in December. It's from a July PowerPoint presentation.
Yep.
And this is a group that was responsible for rolling out the Global New South Wales Network, and it lists you as a member of the Program Steering Committee. So we can infer, my first question, that you were a member of that committee. You were a member of that committee.
I was a member of that committee.
And you're saying that that committee only met once.
I think what I said was, I think it only meant once or twice in my memory.
Sure, but to the extent to which you in your opening statement say you had a limited role, that doesn't provide the full picture, does it, Mr Carr? Because you clearly were a member of the Program Steering Committee that was rolling out the entire network, correct?
Okay, perhaps for context, Mr Mookie, the Program Steering Committee makes reference to a Sue Doyle. I'm not even sure I know who that is. A Tracy Wilson, who's the CIO of New South Wales Treasury. I'm also not sure as to who she is.
Carr, sorry, just to return to the question.
Yep.
You were a member of the Program Steering Committee, correct?
Yes, I was.
And that committee was responsible for the rollout of the global network, correct?
No, Mr Mookie, that steering committee had a more of an it was set up, sorry, take a step back. As you'll note from the document, Mr Mookie, the chair was the program sponsor, Jenny West, So she had established this. The meeting document that you've tendered from July was very shortly after I joined the government. Ms West, I think, was attempting to set up a form of oversight for the rollout of the program, but the actual rollout was dealt with more at an operational level, because the operational questions don't go to a level that, for example, Steve Cox, the Destination New South Wales CEO, would be across, and he was also a member of that steering committee.
Thank you, Mr Carr. I appreciate that. But all I'm saying is, when you said you had a limited role, that's not the full picture, is it? You were part of this committee. As you just said there, it was an oversight committee.
Sorry, I did have a limited role. I think attending a 1-hour meeting in July is not... Yeah, okay.
Mr Carr. Mr Carr, can I just go on, just before we get into the main line of questioning, you made reference in your opening statements to emails that you were copied in on 9 September 2021. Did I read that correct?
One email, yes.
Do you have a copy of that?
Not with me, no.
Do you know why that wasn't produced to the upper house when we called for it?
My understanding, Mr Mookie, is that documents that are ultimately used for the purposes of cabinet deliberations are not normally lawfully required to be produced under Standing Order 52.
Okay, thank you. You say in your opening statement that you had limited to no contact with the Deputy Premier's office. Is that correct? Is that a fair summation?
Yep.
So did you attend any of the fortnightly meetings that the Investment New South Wales CEO had with the Deputy Premier's office?
I never attended one of those meetings, not one.
Did you ever have any routine calls of any type with any member of the Deputy Premier's office?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Did you ever have any routine engagement or contact with any member of the Deputy Premier's office? I don't know how best to summarise this, Mr Mookie. The entirety of my engagement with the Deputy Premier's office was around that time. I've best summarised in my opening my interactions. Before that, I had no interactions with the Deputy Premier's office. And you never briefed the Deputy Premier directly? Nope. And you never had any contact with Mr Brailwood directly on phone?
Not that I am aware of. I think I went back and checked my files, and all I could uncover was what I've referred to.
Oh. Can you turn to page 16 of the tender bundle, please? So this is an email which we asked Ms Brown about when she was in front of us. Did you see Ms Brown's evidence by any chance?
I did.
And have you had the opportunity to familiarise yourself with the transcript?
I've read it.
Can you turn to page 19 of the tender bundle? So we asked Ms Brown who precisely was responsible for commissioning the production of the advice which you referred to in that email. And she goes, the Deputy Premier's office got in touch with you directly. And if you see that's at the highlighted section at the bottom of page 19. And you can see on page 20, Ms Brown tells us, I don't know the chain of how he was instructed, whether he was called directly or what. And then I asked, was it an advisor in the Deputy Premier's office or was it the Deputy Premier himself? Ms Brown quite definitively goes, it was an advisor in the Deputy Premier's office. I go to the Deputy Premier's office, asked, were you notified of the request? I was already aware of the request. So there's just a straight contradiction between what you've told us and what Ms Brown told us. Ms Brown has told us quite clearly that this particular advice that was sought by the Deputy Premier's office came to you directly from an advisor in the Deputy Premier's office. Was Ms Brown wrong?
Ms Brown's evidence, Mr Mookie, was that I don't know the chain of how he was instructed.
Well, yes, no, I say that. I see that true.
My evidence is that my evidence, Mr Mookie, is that I was instructed through a combination of the Chief Executive Officer of Investment New South Wales or her office.
So Ms Brown instructed you directly?
Some of the instructions around that time would have come from Ms Brown, the Investment New South Wales CEO, and some of them would have come from her Chief of Staff.
Well, I asked Ms Brown, did you instruct the General Counsel? And she goes, no.
I think, Mr Mookie...
She goes, I asked, the question, if you go back to the bottom of page 19, the question that I did ask you, which you didn't answer, was did you ask your General Counsel to consider whether there are alternative methods that the sticks could be employed? Did you make the request to the General Counsel? Ms Brown, I believe the request was made from a particular minister's office. Which minister's office? The Deputy Premier's office. So there's at least, and Mr Carr, to be very clear here, I'm not suggesting you're wrong, but there is a straight out two contradictions between what you're telling us and what Ms Brown told us just 2 weeks ago. She told us. She didn't ask you. You're telling me that she did. So can you tell us, when did she ask?
I think, just to be clear, in my opening, and again, my evidence has been that at that time, the instructions I received were through a combination of the CEO of Investment New South Wales and her Chief of Staff.
Sorry, I don't see how we can draw a distinction between her and her Chief of Staff. So if it came from her Chief of Staff, I'm presuming that the Chief of Staff was acting on Ms Brown's distinction. So do you want to tell us, when did you get the request from Ms Brown?
I don't have the date with me, but it would have been early September.
Well, she says that she got the request from the Deputy Premier's office around the 6th of September. Was it on the 6th of September?
I think I just gave the answer to that it was early September.
I'm pushing you for a more direct answer, please. I'm asking you, there's a 2-week discrepancy between the 6th of September and when you write this email on the 21st. So
I'm sorry, Mr Mookie, but I think in my opening I was quite clearly saying that my initial advice was provided on the 9th of September, just to be clear. So the instructions would have come before the 9th of September in order for me to have produced initial advice.
Okay, so this is it. Thank you, Mr Carr, that's helpful. How many advices did you produce?
There would be more than one because, as I've also outlined, I did receive some questions subsequent to that from a junior officer in Minister Barilaro's office. But they were related to the Commonwealth Constitution and they were related to the Commonwealth's Foreign Relations Act.
So in your opening statement, you were copied on an email on 9 September 2021 that attached my initial advice. So did you send your advice to Ms Brown? Or did you send it directly to the Deputy Premier's office?
I did not send anything directly to the Deputy Premier's office, so it would have gone possibly in combination. I would need to check that.
You know why that advice wasn't produced to the Upper House?
I think that's the same advice that you've asked the earlier question about.
No, it's a different issue. Legal advice is routinely provided to the Upper House.
You're claiming that it was a Cabinet document?
I'm claiming that the advice that was given was then used for the purposes of Cabinet deliberations, which my understanding is should not need to be lawfully produced under a Standing Order 52.
So you provided your advice, your first advice, or initial advice is the term you use,
Yep.
on the 9th of September to somebody. Do you remember who?
It was either, this is an either or, Mr Mookie, just to be clear, it was either the Investment New South Wales CEO or a combination of her and her Chief of Staff.
Okay. And then she presumably sends it on to Mr Brayford.
The email to Mr Brayford, if it would be helpful, Mr Mookie, was sent by the Investment New South Wales Chief of Staff.
Okay, that is helpful, thank you. And that includes your advice, and that's CC'd. Correct.
I was CC'd.
Yes.
Yes.
And that initial advice, request for that advice, was that given to you in writing?
No.
How were you asked?
I would have taken a phone call from, again, without belabouring the point, my phone doesn't go back in sufficient time to know. I certainly tried to check that in order to prepare. It would have been either or. I mean, I'm trying to be as helpful as I can.
You are, Mr Carr. And to be clear, you are
one of
helpful.
those two people would have called me and asked, this request has come.
And then presumably, if you got the request circa sometime from the 6th of September onwards and you turned around initial advice, I presume that you were instructed or asked to provide the advice quickly?
Mr Mookie, unfortunately, in my experience, in my limited experience in government, every piece of advice I'm asked seems to come with a degree of urgency, and that was no different.
Well, I'm sure, Mr Carr, but I'm asking you, were you asked specifically to provide the advice quickly?
I don't have the calendar in front of me, but I feel like it was done over the weekend.
Okay. And
during lockdown.
And Miss Brown and or her Chief of Staff asked you for the advice. That is your clear recollection?
I was asked the specific policy question that we had, and it's a question that I took the time that I had available to assess why they are done that way in New South Wales. And I was asked in relation to how they would be converted to ministerial appointments, given that, for example, Victoria does it that way.
Sure. And but again, Mr Carr, I'm just now got to go back to the fact that there is now even a bigger contradiction between what you're saying and what Miss Brown told us. I mean, Miss Brown never disclosed that she asked for the advice, let alone that you provided it to her, let alone that she forwarded it on to Mr Brayford, and that this all took place 2 weeks prior to any point we knew before. Do you know?
So just to be very clear, and I'm not sure if I said this earlier, but the email that was sent to Mr Brayford came from came from the Chief of Staff of the CEO of Investment New South Wales. So I want to be very clear
You
about
are very
that.
clear on that
Okay.
point, and there's no. I'm not disputing that.
Sorry, but you
my
just said
point
that the
is
CEO...
Yeah, and I'm going to take a point of order at this point, Chair, because I think what Mr Mookie is doing is Mr Carr is making quite clear his answers. What Mr Mookie is doing, and then he's rephrasing the answers given by Mr Carr, claiming that there are
What's the
contradictions,
point of
which they
order?
are not.
That's
The
not a
point of order. Is
That's an
that,
argument.
No, the point of order is that Mr Mookie is respondent to the procedural fairness resolution of the House, and what the line of questioning at the moment, I do not believe, is respondent to that resolution.
To the point of order, can I just say, I think that Mr Mookie, look, to be honest, I think Mr Carr's doing very well. And I think that Mr Mookie is asking him questions that flow from the answers that he's giving. I don't believe that this is a point of order at all.
Well, to that point of order, I would say that I understand Mr Mookie
Come on,
asking
Wes,
questions.
he doesn't need your help.
Courtney,
Order.
I'm making a point of order here.
Order. Address the chair.
Well, I will be if I wasn't interrupted by other people. Chair, the point is that Mr Mookie is entitled to ask questions out of the answers given by Mr Carr. What he's not entitled to do is make reflections on those answers, claiming that they are creating a incomplete picture when I'm getting the complete picture from the answers Mr Carr is giving.
Thank you. There's no point of order.
Thank you. Just to be clear,
can you repeat the question?
I will be. And I just want to do this because I want to be very fair to Ms Brown too, because there is an apparent contradiction between what you're telling us and what Ms Brown told us. Ms Brown has said quite clearly that she didn't make the request to you, and that the request came from an advisor in the Deputy Premier's office. I just want to be very clear, and I'm going to move on, Mr Carr, from this particular point, is that your best recollection is that in some phone call from probably the Investment New South Wales Chief of Staff to the CEO, sometime between the 6th and the 9th of September, you were asked to provide advice on conversion to ministerial appointments, and you then did provide that advice.
I was asked, there's two limbs to the question I was asked, to be very clear, is I was asked for advice on why in New South Wales they are public service appointments. It's, the evidence I've given, I think Mr Mookie touches on this, that it was not an instruction that came directly from the Deputy Premier's office, which I think is where you're heading with this, and I'm categorical on that. Sure. As to who rang me at the time, Mr Mookie, I really did check.
Was one of those two?
It was one of those two.
Thank you. That's fine, Mr Carr.
If I were able, or if I were able to go back and if the phone accounts would show me, I'd be happy to give that account. But I think under questioning, and my understanding of the of the Secretary's evidence at the time is that she wasn't sure of the chain of instructions, and I think that's consistent with my recollection. I'm not specifically familiar with the chain of how that came to be with me.
Thank you, Mr Carr. Is that your recollection as the first time you were asked? Was it the first time you were asked to provide advice on that policy question around the 6th of September or September?
It was the first time in terms of the full question, yes.
No other earlier incident you can recall?
Well, I would have been asked, I think at one stage the Deputy Secretary's office, and to be clear, that's Ms West we're talking about, asked me in relation to whether these roles should go to the Governor, which I provided advice on, which was that they don't. I may have been asked other advice intermittently. I should also point out that prior to this being with Investment New South Wales, because we've got to bear in mind, this is very newly into Investment New South Wales we're talking, another department had carriage of that. Yep. Also, I wasn't working in government, so we're talking about a very small window. There may have been occasions I was asked questions.
Can I just ask you to search your memory about do you recall any specific requests around the question of conversion to ministerial appointments around July last year?
Conversion to ministerial appointments around July, I've got no recollection of that.
Do you recall any conversations with Ms Brown in which she sought your advice or request for any information on that around July last year or June last year?
I think over time, just to be clear, the CEO of Investment New South Wales would on occasion ask or discuss how these appointments get made and the overlay of the GSE Act and the GSE regulations, because I think, as everybody probably by now appreciates, these are not ordinary public service roles. They're a little bit.
So we found out.
Well, but in order to therefore get to where these things are done in the way that they ought be done, it is open to the CEO to seek the advice of.
And there's nothing inappropriate with that, Mr. Carr. Just to be very clear.
I don't think the question of conversion, though, which I think was your question, Mr. Mookie, I don't think that had ever come up. But the question as to process and how it gets done, I think would have come up.
Can I just ask you to again, just search your memory for July last year about whether or not the CEO or the Chief Operating Officer, Ms. Bray, did any of them, or the Chief of Staff, or anyone else in Investment New South Wales, but particularly those three, did any of them inform you that a request had come from the Deputy Premier's office in July last year for advice on this question?
You've asked me to search my memory for that, Mr. Mookie. I can take that question on notice if that would assist, because
You don't have any immediate recollection?
in terms of my immediate thoughts as to what transpired at the time, can we contextualise it that if you start a role in government on the 16th of June, I had 8 days physically present in the office before the state went into lockdown. Subsequent to that, we were managing things like RNA potential projects. We were managing how do we manage and support our staff and other.
I don't disagree with you. I'm just asking.
The fact that there may or may not have been questions around this would have been on the periphery, frankly, of my broader role for the.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Agency.
Can I ask you to turn to page 10 of the tender bundle?
Yep.
Indulgence. Happy for me to continue? Thank you. Just at the bottom of page 10 of the tender bundle, this is an email from Ms Brown to Mr Brayford in the Deputy Premier's office. That is 2 July 2021, 10:24 p.m. Hi Joseph, further to your question on the above. Can you turn to the next page?
Yep.
You can see here that Ms Brown provides 7 points of advice in response to what I infer is a question about conversion. And you can just see here, if you go to the last dot point, you can see here there is complexity around the sticks being statutory officers, which may make it more appropriate to train their status as public servants. The day-to-day activities of the sticks are subject to the direction and control of the CEO or Investment New South Wales, and each stick has a strong KPI around their output. Statutory officers' appointments to a minister are not subject to the direction and control of the agency CEO, making those KPIs difficult to monitor and enforce. Additionally, all the staff supporting the sticks offshore and New South Wales government offices will continue to be public services. Their reporting lines will be difficult to maintain when the sticks are independent statutory officers, but their staff are not. Now, that's the 6th point of advice on substantially the same question you're asked in September, which is around conversion. Now, firstly, I presume you haven't seen this email before. Did you provide any draft instructions to Ms Brown similar to this?
Again, Mr Mookie,
just because there's a technical legal point. Some of these
I understand that, but I also understand that the head of an agency would probably have some familiarity with how their employer functions would operate.
That wasn't my question. My question was, did you provide any of the text that was used in this email?
Sorry, and I'm not meaning to quarrel with you, Mr Mookie, but you did say that it was technical advice and complex advice, so I was in response to the question.
And I'm not a Mr Carr, but did you provide any of the draft?
Look, as I said, I haven't seen this email. Whether I was asked, within the first 2 weeks of my employment in the government for this particular question, bearing in mind, Mr Mookie, and it is relevant, that until the 1st of July, which is a day before this email was sent, a lot of the carriage of that was actually with Treasury as part of the transition to Investment New South Wales. So, for instance, and I think it's helpful, when I started on the 16th, I didn't have an @investment email address. I had an @treasury email address. So I want to be very careful to say to you, I'm not going to say absolutely I wasn't asked that question. I'm just saying to you that in the first 2 weeks, I struggle to see how, given that others had carriage of this before that, that there's not an alternate.
Mr. Carr, you make a good point. And part of the issue that is interesting about this particular email is that it's sent the very second day after Investment New South Wales takes responsibility from this. Like, that's the point, actually.
Sorry, to be very clear, Mr. Mookie, I wasn't saying that it was the day after Investment New South Wales took responsibility. I was saying it was the day after the legal support for Investment New South Wales had transitioned off Treasury, because Investment New South Wales would have taken responsibility for this on the 29th of March when it was established under those administrative arrangements orders.
That's helpful context, Mr. Carr. But the point is, just to the actual question, you didn't provide the draft text to Ms. Brown, to the best of your recollection.
Chair, with respect, I'm trying very hard to answer. I believe I've answered that question.
Okay, I'll move on, Mr. Carr. But it is clear here that the Deputy Premier's office is inquiring from Investment New South Wales as early as July 2021 around conversions. Were you aware of that when you were requested to provide the advice around the 6th of September?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question, Mr. Mookie?
Given it's quite clear that the Deputy Premier's office was making inquiries about converting, of Ms Brown at least, of converting the stick appointments into ministerial appointments from at least 2 July 2021, were you aware of that when you were asked to provide the advice on the 6th of September?
Was I aware in September, and I don't think I said that the advice was 6th of September. I think I said it was early September. Was I aware around that time of this previous email from July? I think when it was raised with me in early September that I was eager to ensure that I looked at this with fresh eyes, Mr. Mookie. So whether, as I said very clearly, I haven't seen this email. You've produced it to me today. It's the first time I've seen it. If I'd been provided it in the context of a later advice that I was asked to provide, I would have given it consideration, but it wouldn't have formed the heavy basis for it.
So just returning to the request that you received, I think sometime between the 6th and the 9th of September.
So, Mr. Mookie, I've just been handed a note in clarification to one of your questions. I understand that the advice that you're talking about at the bottom of this 2 July email that I've just been provided was actually provided by the General Counsel of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and as you'll appreciate, Investment New South Wales was a related department to the Department of Premier and Cabinet at the time.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
So, to your actual question, I therefore, having never seen this email, probably wouldn't have necessarily taken it in mind.
You've answered the question now, Mr. Carr, very clearly. Okay. Thank you very much.
Can I just follow up?
Please.
Despite this email, so we've got the September advice where you provided extensive advice in relation to the conversion of the things. How many other times did you verbally or otherwise provide advice to Ms Brown or to her Chief of Staff in relation to the conversion of these appointments?
So, to be very precise to your question, Ms Sharp, about conversion, because I was asked, as I said, on multiple occasions as to why these people are appointed as public servants. As to the question of conversion, it first meaningfully came up on this phone call that I can't determine whether it was the CEO or the Chief of Staff in early September as to conversion.
But the method of appointment was a discussion point within the department. It was something that was being actively canvassed by the CEO or her Chief of Staff with you over a period of time.
I want to be careful about the word canvassed, if I can, Ms Housos, because I think it's become clear that there were 2 appointments that went where they ought not have gone, and so therefore...
Oh, you mean 2 appointments that went to Cabinet?
That went to Cabinet, and in my defence, at least one of those happened before I was even working for the New South Wales Government. I think I've got to be careful that it was the idea of something being canvassed. No, there was a desire ongoing to ensure that we were doing these things in the appropriate way.
But there was complete confusion. I mean, the Parliament's been given a lot of advice from the Premier and the Minister responsible in relation to what happened or not, and they're very quick to say that these were hands-off appointments that didn't require sign-off. We've seen through the entirety of this process today that there were some that went to Cabinet, there were some that didn't go to Cabinet, there were some that were actually signed off and approved by ministers, there were some that were not. We're just trying to get an understanding of you're trying to be very precise advice within a very close period, but we're trying to understand your involvement in the ongoing discussions about the way in which these appointments were made.
I would categorise my involvement in this as quite limited, Ms. Sharp.
Well, I would actually disagree. I mean, it's clear. So you've given some advice, and you're just not able to. What I'm asking for is, it's clear that there is a lot of discussion. Whether you don't like the word canvas, I'm happy to go with discussion about the nature of these and these appointments and the way in which people were employed and under what circumstances. I'm trying to ask you to tell us, aside from the formal written advice, which you didn't provide because it was a cabinet process, what other discussions did you have with the Chief of Staff or with the CEO of Investment New South Wales from the time that you were appointed in relation to these positions?
Okay, so I guess, and apologies, again, I'm not trying to quarrel, but part of the difficulty I have is that, yes, there was advice prepared. It takes time in an organisation for it to filter down to operational people, and I would say that throughout that time I did find myself repeating myself to say that these are public service appointments, they're not to be cabinet appointments, and so the idea that it instantly flows through from advice that's provided at that level all the way down to operational is not quite correct. It's not an instant thing, it does take time, and we got there, but it did take some time.
That is helpful. And can we just return to page 16 of the tender bundle, if you don't mind? And we've established that you provided initial advice as the way in which you termed it in your opening statement to the Office of the Investment New South Wales CEO that was then forwarded by them to Mr. Brayford. Can you take us through what happens between that and the 21st of September 2021?
Between the 9th of September and the 21st of September?
Between your initial advice and the 21st of September?
The advice went out. I think in that time, as I mentioned in my opening, I was asked to attend one call. I think that there would have been consideration had given the relevant window as to how that advice was to be applied.
So one call with whom?
With a junior advisor. I'm careful not to name people, Mr. Mookie. It's a junior advisor in the former Deputy Premier's office, who...
Why don't we refer to them as the advisor on trade?
No, to be clear, it was not Mr. Joseph Brayford. It was another advisor, a junior advisor, and I'm being careful because that was... I had one interaction with a small number of questions in that time.
Who else was on the call?
Nobody.
You and that person. And what did you organise it or did they organise it?
The request, my recollection was that the advisor had a series of questions, and then by the time that the call was...
Organised the call?
The call went via the Chief of Staff. The CEO's Chief of Staff sent a meeting invite both to that advisor and to myself, but as I've said, the Chief of Staff didn't attend the call. It was on some very narrow legal questions. I was given a...
What were you told was the purpose of the meeting?
To address some questions out of my advice.
Okay. And that's and the meeting was on because we were in lockdown this time. Was it on a Teams call?
It was a Teams call.
Yep. And what were the questions you were asked to provide further follow-up on?
I think I covered that in my opening, Mr.
Do you mind just repeating it now for me, Mr.
Yep. So whereas I was sent questions in advance, those questions were not particularly raised. There was a question on the Commonwealth's Foreign Relations Act and a question in relation to the foreign affairs power in the Commonwealth Constitution.
And they sent you questions in advance, you said?
I was sent additional questions in advance, but they weren't discussed on the call because it was...
Additional questions?
The additional questions, I'm going to be very careful here because the additional questions therefore go to matters of deliberations subsequent. So,
to be fair, Mr. Carr, that's not necessarily the case. But I'll hear you out first, and then we'll see. But let's go.
I'm going to take a point of order. Mr. Carr is clearly trying to articulate that he is going to be very careful with the answers. Now, it is obviously open to Mr. Carr that he can take the question on notice and provide it.
What's the point of order?
Well, I think Mr. Mookie...
You're not here to coach the witness, Mr. Fang.
Chair, I'm not coaching the witness. I am...
Not raising a point of order.
Raising a point of order.
What? Are we going in stereo now? Okay, I'm trying to address a point of order in a calm, concise manner. I don't need interjections from the
chair.
opposition.
I'll decide that, not you.
Well,
address the chair.
I'm going to raise the point of order yet again that the procedural fairness resolution is quite clear that Mr. Carr can elect to answer the question in the way that he wishes, and that Mr. Mookie directing him and badgering him as he is not recognising that procedural fairness resolution, and I'd ask that you direct him to do so.
I've seen Mr. Mookie badger witnesses in the past, and this is not an exercise in badgering by Mr. Mookie. There is no point of order.
Sorry, Mr. Carr, I was asking you what were the additional questions you were asked that were not addressed?
Chair, I'm afraid that they go to detail of an email a meeting invite that would have been.
You can answer the question or not. It's up to you.
I would
Just
like to
clearly
take
state you will or not answer it, and on what grounds you're not going to answer it.
I'm actually saying, Chair, that I'd like to take that question on notice.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just, sorry, I'll take a point of order now.
Yep.
Chair, the witness is entitled to take questions on notice, but to be clear here, that is a discretion of the committee, actually, and the committee is entitled to understand the reasons for why the witness is taking it on notice. Now, I understand that the witness may wish, and look, to be fair, we may agree with him. If the witness can establish that this is material which is cabinet in confidence, then that's one issue. But there's no basis to decline answering a question or taking a question on notice without providing us with at least some reasons as to why.
I believe he has, Mr. Mookie.
On notice. Maybe we can let the witness provide.
I think that's what I said in my previous ruling.
But I will just sort of stress that whether or not this is matters to cabinet is a complicated question. And if it is the case that the witness is taking it on notice because the witness is of the view that this is a cabinet in confidence information, I would just point out that that would jar with all the rulings that the House has adopted when it comes to what is and what is not cabinet information. Because what we've always consistently maintained as a House is that only information which relates to the actual deliberations of cabinet fall within the privilege. Questions that the minister...
To the point of order.
Sorry.
To the point of order.
I haven't finished,
No, it hasn't finished.
Just information that is provided to the witness in an email for a meeting request doesn't fall within the... unlikely to reveal the actual deliberations of cabinet, because to be clear here, Cabinet hasn't yet deliberated on any of these questions. And that Cabinet deliberations took place 10 days after the chronology.
So what's the basis upon which you're taking this on notice, Mr.
Well,
Carr?
to the point of order.
Hang on, I've asked a question.
And I'm addressing the point of order that Mr. Mookie raised.
I've asked a question, and you can,
addressing
you can address
the point
it
of order that
afterwards.
Mr. Mookie's raised.
Are you dissenting from my motion?
No, I'm asking you to hear my addressing of Mr. Mookie's...
I will hear you after I hear Mr. Carr.
Mr. Mookie, the purpose of that call was that in preparation for what would need to come next, I had a request from an advisor through the Investment New South Wales' Chief of Staff if I could provide some answers to some questions. As to the specifics, Chair, as to why I need to take it on order, take the question on notice, I don't have an immediate recollection of the specifics of that particular request. And I think, in fairness, I'm being asked about an invitation, a meeting invitation that was sent close to a year ago. I went back and checked what was actually discussed, and that's why I gave that answer in my opening. As to what was not discussed, I tend not to retain that.
Chair, I won't push the point of order.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fang?
Well, I was just going to make the point of order, Chair, that the witness is entitled, if there is questions around whether evidence is to cabinet in confidence or not, and needs to seek advice on that, then that is well within the remit to take the question on notice.
That's no point of order, but anyway, okay.
That's not a point of order. It was a point. It was addressing the point of order that Mr. Mookie raised.
Order.
Thank you.
You don't make debating points.
You don't have a specific and direct recollection. Do you have any recollection of the questions you were asked ahead of that meeting to address, regardless of whether or not you were addressed them?
As I said, a meeting, I get...
But you've established...
I'm not trying to be difficult. It's a meeting invitation that was sent a long time ago, Mr. Mookie, and we've had a lot to deal with in the interim.
Mr. Carr, you've been able to say that you weren't asked about any of those issues at the meeting, so surely you do then recall what the questions were.
No, I think the point is that in preparation for today, I went back and checked what my summary of that meeting was.
Well, did you keep a written record of the meeting?
What I did was I corresponded back with the Chief of Staff as to the outcomes of that meeting.
Which Chief of Staff? The Investment New South Wales Chief of Staff?
The Investment New South Wales Chief of Staff.
So again, none of these records are produced to the upper house at all. It is, given that they are unlikely to contain the specific deliberations of Cabinet, because Cabinet hadn't yet deliberated. Can you explain why none of these documents have been produced?
I think
Did you provide them to production, for production?
I'm sorry?
Did you provide them for production?
So you're asking me in relation to, I mean, we can get the order out from last year if you'd like.
I have, Mr. Carr.
Okay, I'm going to take a point of order now. Because, no. Don't tell me I can't take a point of order, Mr. Mookie. Chair, I'm going to take a point of order. The SA52 related to documents related to this appointment. Now, my understanding is that...
Point of order.
What's the point of order?
I'm getting to it. Would you stop interjecting and interrupting?
On what basis are you taking it? On what basis are you taking it a point of order?
Don't get excited.
It's very straightforward. You actually have to raise where the standing orders are being breached, not just what you think.
Yeah, pot calling kettle black. Last time I asked you, Ms. Sharp, about what the point of what the standing order was, and you couldn't identify it, and it turned out I was right last week. Chair, the standing order 52 returns related to the role. Now, if Mr. Mookie believes that there are documents that are outside of that fall within it from this, then it's up to Mr. Mookie to identify.
I'm happy to do that, Chair.
And I would actually seek him to do so before he questions the witness.
I'm very happy to take the Deputy President's suggestion, and I'm happy to, on behalf of, because the Deputy President is right, to put this to Mr. Carr. Mr. Carr, the correspondence that you just referred to and your summary of the meeting that you had to the Chief of Staff has not been produced to the Upper House. Can you explain to me why not?
I'll take that on notice.
Did you provide those emails to the Department of Premier Cabinet for production?
I'll take that on notice.
Do you have any recall of doing that?
I wasn't... At the time, I wasn't overseeing the return.
You're the General Counsel. You're telling me as General Counsel of Investment New South Wales, you were not overseeing the return. Then who was?
Chair,
sorry.
I'm going to raise the next point of order now, which is there was an agreement prior to this meeting that the government would be provided some time to question the witness. We are now almost an hour into the meeting.
Mr. Mookie is using crossbench time.
Well, as I'm going to point out, the agreement was 2020.
Yes, we've got
30 seconds left.
Okay.
And you've wasted
Mr.
most
Carr,
of it, so I'll give him another 30 seconds.
If you aren't responsible as General Counsel for complying with the House's orders or ensuring that your agency does, who is responsible for complying?
So, Mr. Mookie, I was about to answer, and in the context of there's an existing standing order, you will appreciate, for example, last time I checked on the current standing order, there's been a return, or there's been a uncovering of around 3 million documents that need to be sorted.
Mr. Carr.
To be fair, I don't sit there and review and go through all those documents.
I appreciate that, but the question I ask you is about an order that was made last year, not this year. That was made in October last year. If you didn't oversee the production of that, who did?
I would have instructed lawyers from my very small and hard-working team.
You did oversee
that. Well, you asked me, sorry, can I take a step back, Chair? The question I was asked was, do I have a recollection of providing that as part of a return? What my answer was that I don't sit there and review all of the documents that go in as part of a return, and I think that...
But Mr. Carr, this was a document that you produced. It's not like someone else produced it. The reason I'm asking you specifically is because there's no one else I could ask. You had to. It's your email. So hence, I'm happy to discuss it.
I understand the question.
I'm now, Chair, I'm now going to ask a clarifying question on that point. Now, Mr. Carr, in your statement, you identify on the front page that you have 4 initial comments. On the third one, it is related to the interactions that you had with Minister Barilaro's office during the time that he was Minister. It was about a junior advisor asking questions on the Teams call. Now, I believe that the email that you sent to the Chief of Staff related to the meeting that you had with that junior advisor from that meeting. Is it possible that during that meeting you did not discuss the trade sticks appointments at all, that it related to other matters such as the Commonwealth Constitution and the Commonwealth Foreign Relations Act questions, and that the reason that the documents weren't returned in the SA52 is because it didn't actually relate at all to the sticks advice? There was no sticks advice because that wasn't actually the relation to the call. You were only addressing the times that you had interaction with Mr. Barilaro's office.
Thank you for the question. The reality was I had provided advice My understanding, and I can't speak for the intentions of others, but my understanding was that that advice was then to be used as the formation for matters that were then to be deliberated before Cabinet. It is, I don't think it's right to say that it had nothing to do with the sticks, because the question related to the ability of the Commonwealth potentially to stop legislation or stop political appointments is my recollection of how that went. And likewise, the Foreign Relations Act was very new, and we didn't have a proper or full understanding of the implications that might have, and whether that would be something that would be deliberated subsequently, I can't speak to, but yeah, that was the nature of the advice. So I can't really add to that.
Okay. So
It was one very short phone call, one very long time ago.
yeah, and so it's possible that in relation to the response that you gave to the Chief of Staff by correspondence afterwards, that you detailed the interactions between the Commonwealth Constitution and the advice relating to the Foreign Relations Act. If the search terms, for example, sticks or whatever, were to not have been mentioned in that email, then it may not have come up in the search. Is that fair to say?
Well, so if you just give me a chance to find the order.
Yeah.
I mean, the order... The order itself is not particularly clearly worded in some
They
respects.
tend not to be, yeah.
All documents related to the recruitment process. Just to be clear, the questions I was discussing with the Deputy Premier's office was not about the recruitment process, which was the scope of this order. They were related to how do you appoint these people, and a technical question as to the ability of other arms of in our system to prevent that. This is not, I take recruitment process to be, well, how do you advertise? How do you do this? Whereas this was more of a question as to
high-level technical, legal.
But more than that, it was not. The questions were not about recruitment processes. I wasn't. As the General Counsel, I typically am not asked about recruitment processes. I'm more usually or typically asked to provide legal advice. So, having just reread this, in fairness, the order is about recruitment processes. The questions we're talking about.
How someone is appointed is fairly material to the recruitment
Ms.
process.
Sharp, it's not your time, and unless you're raising a point of order, as you quite rightly said.
No, I'm interjecting.
Well, then, yeah, just interjecting.
Order,
Thank you.
order.
Yeah.
Mr. Carr's answer.
Interjections are disorderly.
Halfway through.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Look, I'm happy to leave it at that. Look, I took the advice I was providing to be more in relation to how these appointments could be, to use others' terms, but how they could be converted to ministerial appointments.
Okay, so to the to Mr. Mookie's, I guess, point that he is attempting to suggest you were somewhat delinquent in your role in returning these documents as the order articulates, it would be an unfair characterisation of Mr. Mookie to say that you weren't diligent in trying to provide everything to the Parliament. Would that be fair?
Mr. Fang,
Well, that's what you inferred, Mr. Mookie.
Point of order. I'm actually going to take a point of order at this
Please.
point, which
And what standing order?
Order, order.
in terms of the question, and actually not using, not verballing other members of the committee in the way that they ask the question.
Like,
you can follow up
like the member verbals that...
Order,
So you
Interjecting. Apparently that's the rules now.
order.
Yeah.
My point of order is that if the member has a problem with the way in which opposition members are asking questions, he can actually raise that in the way that we actually ask questions, not reframe these and make assertions to witnesses in relation to those questions.
I uphold the point of order. The member should not be putting words in the witness's mouth, seeking the sort of answers he's looking for.
I'll remind you of that ruling when Mr. Mookie's asking questions,
Order.
Chair. Mr. Carr. In relation to the other interactions that you've had with Mr Barilaro's office. There, as you've outlined in your opening statement, is that correct?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Limited is how I would characterise it.
At no time did you ever take direction from Mr Barilaro's office or Mr Barilaro to seek advice, that they sought advice from you, written or otherwise, about these matters?
No, not to me, no.
And they haven't directed you in any way around this evidence today?
No.
No. So
Just can I clarify?
Please.
I don't know these people. I haven't met them. I haven't interacted with them. We were in lockdown. I was copied on a couple of emails, and I attended one Teams call.
Yeah.
It's really, really limited.
Yeah, and so the attempt to, I guess, characterise your involvement anything other than on the periphery and limited is, in your view, unfair?
I'm not giving opinions on people's views on these things. All I've said is I really don't know these people. I haven't dealt with them. I've set out the extent of it, and it's very difficult. I should say, Mr. Fang, it's very difficult for a public servant to sit here who was asked advice to then be having to sort of go into chapter and verse as to other aspects. I just do not pass opinion. It's for other people to make.
And I appreciate that, and I think the candour with which you've provided your evidence today has really shone through. And so I'm prepared now to pass the questioning back over, but I will reserve some further time later.
Thank you, Deputy President. Is that all right, Mr Chair, if I may resume?
Please.
Thank you. Mr Carr, can we just turn back to where we were up to in the chronology?
Which was?
Well, we can turn to page 16 of the tender bundle, but I think you just established, and I'm not going to pursue it any further, that there was a Teams call with a junior member of the Barilaro team in which you addressed the issues you referred to in your opening statement, and that there were questions that you were asked prior that weren't raised. What happens after that?
I have very limited involvement. I think subsequently there's some emails on the 27th or thereabouts that ask for a follow-up call.
Can we turn to the question, the email on page 20, on page 16?
Yep.
Is a draft email.
Yep.
That I think Ms Brown tells us that you end up sending to, I think, the General Counsel of the Public Service Commission. Is that your recollection?
That is my recollection, yes, because as I pointed out, Mr Mookie, the advice that was on the 9th would have been preliminary advice or initial advice, I think is how I would characterise it. We had to expand on that because as these things evolve, as you appreciate, people have questions, you then expand on the advice and it gets broader. One of those things that one of those things that we wanted to explore was the highly technical question as to whether instead of a conversion via legislation, whether in fact you could convert or amend Regulation 10A, which deals with overseas trade employees. These were 6 of many overseas trade employees. So the Public Service Commission, being an independent overseer, custodian, if you like, of the public service and these acts and these regulations, I felt was probably a good starting place to test whether that could be.
So you sought their advice because predominantly they're experts in that part of the law?
I just couldn't imagine a scenario where you would be changing Regulation 10A without consulting with the Public Service Commission. I don't see how it would be appropriate.
And so you therefore initiated the contact with the Public Service Commission? I
reached out, and the email that you've tendered, Mr Mookie, just to be clear, is a draft email.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you reached out?
I did reach out.
And you presumably had a call scheduled that day? On the
I don't know if it was that day. It may have been the next day.
Oh, look, I'm just going from the top of the email. He says ahead of our call today.
Yep.
Yeah, but it would have been around that time. Correct?
Yep, that day or the next day.
So this is, and you ended up sending this email? Or version of this email?
Very similar to this, I would think.
And I think you may have sent it on the same day or thereabouts, is that correct?
I guess I would have waited for feedback. I sent it to a colleague for comments. Usually you'd wait for comments. I suspect after that I would have
Well, I think you
sent
did,
it promptly.
to be fair, Mr. Carr, yes. But I'm just going to ask, so can you turn to if you go down to the first highlighted section of the page, which says, we're now asked to consider whether there are alternative methods that sticks could be employed. Specifically, we've been asked whether there is an option for ministerial appointments. Who asked you to consider that?
I'm sorry, but I think that's essentially what I've covered, that I was asked the advice originally in terms of why these appointments are under the
Look, I
GSC
appreciate that,
Act
Mr.
and
Carr, but
regs.
in the chain of events, you've provided initial advice on
Yes.
that question on the 9th. You've had another meeting with the Deputy Premier's office on the 17th for first meeting, and then 4 days later, still the request is present in the system, because this is an email that you're being sent on the 21st. You're saying, so the reason why I'm pushing you specifically is on this point is that who was asking you at that point in time to consider whether there is an alternative methods?
So, as you'd appreciate, and I want to be very careful not to go into the realms of cabinet processes, but if a minister were minded to make submissions to cabinet, they may well seek advice around that. I think my advice, which was initial on about 9th of September, on or about 9th of September, was initial advice that was then expanded upon. As it was expanded upon, it became clear that there were questions emerging that needed to be addressed. One of those questions, and I don't really remember how the question came about, but one of the questions that had come about was Regulation 10A, because these are overseas trade employees, so start with that. And it hadn't been, just to be clear, I don't think it had been picked up in my earlier advice.
So I appreciate advice expands, but were you asked to expand the advice to consider this by the Deputy Premier's office?
No.
And so then if it wasn't the Deputy Premier's office...
I don't mean to belabour the point, Chair, but I think I've already addressed my extent of contact with...
Sure, I appreciate that, Mr. Carr.
I keep getting asked the question.
Well, no, because you just made a reference there to you had to be careful in respect to Cabinet.
Yes.
So I'm asking, well, firstly, was Investment New South Wales at this point in time preparing Cabinet advice?
I think I'd want to take that on notice.
Why?
I'm just very, as a public servant, Mr. Mookie, I'm very apprehensive about questions that go to cabinet process, and I think that these are not matters for me to overturn. I need to seek advice on that.
I appreciate that, Mr. Carr, but there is a real question in front of us, which was who actually produced the cabinet submission.
And I'll take a point of order at that point. There's a very real question that's been taken on notice by the witness. And despite Mr. Mookie seeking to amend what has been a very adopted practice in these committees, that when a witness takes a question on notice that they be allowed to do so, I don't ever recall the requirement for us to seek an elucidation from the witness as to why exactly they're seeking to take that question on notice. If it is, then by all means we'll start doing that as a routine part of the committees. But if Mr. Mookie wants to continue that, then I would caution him that will continue across all committees.
Order. Mr. Mookie can ask any question he likes, and Mr. Carr can take whatever he likes on notice. And if Mr. Mookie wants to ask for a reason, Mr. Carr can either give it or not.
But to be fair, Mr. Carr did, and I moved on, Chair.
Yeah.
I appreciate that as well. But Mr. Carr, the question that I was asking was, there is a material question here about whether or not Investment New South Wales produced the cabinet submission or the Deputy Premier's office produced the cabinet submission. Did Investment New South Wales produce the cabinet submission?
That was taken on notice, Chair.
No, it was a different question.
Order. Mr. Fang.
So can I just understand the distinction between the two questions?
Yes.
If you could help me.
Did you produce the first draft? Did Investment New South Wales produce the first draft of the cabinet submission?
I think, and again, I want to be careful as to how we characterise or deal with matters.
Sorry, Mr. Carr, just to be clear, it is already on the public record that the Deputy Premier took a cabinet minute to Cabinet to change the nature and the way in which these were appointed in this period of time. So I don't think you're stepping outside.
I'm not asking you to go.
We're not asking you to step. We're just simply saying who prepared the Cabinet minute, given it was the Deputy Premier, Was it your
Agency.
So
agency?
where I struggle with this and why I've asked if I can take it on notice is because you're going to an area where I have provided legal advice, and I don't believe it's particularly in. I don't believe that this is the forum or the setting for me to be detailing legal advice that I've provided. I'm aware. No, well, hey, sorry.
I will take a point of order. Sorry, Chair, but I just have to take a point of order. And to be fair, for the witness's benefit, like, there's no witness in any committee. It's a matter. It's not a matter for the witness to decide what's relevant to the committee. It's actually a matter for you and the committee to decide what's relevant. But secondly, on this question of legal, I just point out, as we do with all government lawyers, the House's responsibilities of oversighting executive function includes legal advice obtained by the executive arm of government, and that's why there's a distinction to be drawn between a government lawyer and a lawyer who appears for a private citizen or a private citizen, because our responsibilities of oversight includes the quality and calibre of the legal advice that's been provided to the executive government, which at this point we're not even getting into. We're just asking the witness to confirm whether, well, to see whether he's in a position to answer whether or not the matters which he's referring to were to do cabinet or not. So I just don't think we can allow, maybe it'd be helpful, Chair, if we could just allow the witness to understand that that is the rules that apply to the upper house when it comes to oversight.
Well, to what I think was a point of order, although I'm not actually sure, Chair, I agree with Mr Mookie in that I did point out last week that the oversight rules of this committee extend past many of the conventions that we have in this place in the legal framework. However, it's also of the witnesses' remit that they can take the question on notice, which they have done. So to that point, as your ruling was earlier elucidated, Chair, the witness can take the question on notice. They have, and so I think that that's the end of that matter.
Chair, the Deputy President is incorrect when he says that the witness took it on notice. The witness was saying he's not in a position to answer. There's a difference. And I'll just point out that this is a lawful question. Under the Parliamentary Evidence Act,
there were many lawful questions.
Do you want to reframe the question?
I'm happy to return to the core question, which I'm seeking an answer to.
I think we've lost the thread of all of this.
Sure. Chair, Mr Carr, did Investment New South Wales create the first draft of the Cabinet submission?
Mr Mookie, respectfully, maybe, Chair, would it help that on occasion when providing legal advice, it is possible, and I'm not speaking to specifics but generalities, it is possible for that advice to include formulations that a minister or others may consider if they wanted to take it forward for cabinet consideration. Okay. I'm being careful because it's not my privilege to waive, and if Mr Mookie, if you do want me to go and seek the Crown Solicitor's advice, that's where I have to go for this, because it's not my privilege to waive.
Well, to be fair, Mr Carr, I'm not seeking...
Okay.
I'm prepared to move on. But just to be clear here, when you said on this page 16, we are now asked to consider whether there are alternative methods, that request, do you have any recollection of who was asking you at this point in time to continue on this line of inquiry?
I think at the time... if my recollection's correct, given Investment New South Wales was an agency related to the Department of Premier and Cabinet, I recall I had a conversation with the General Counsel of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, because they would have ordinary carriage, as an agency as opposed to a department, they would have ordinary carriage of matters that were going to Cabinet, and that's... Okay. My recollection is that I would have discussed 10A with the General Counsel at that point.
Yeah. Can I just, look, I'm not going to have too many more questions about this particular email, but then if you go down to the second highlighted section on page 16, which is a specific suggestion, which you've made reference to in your earlier answer, around amending Regulation 10A so it's feasible to provide for the relevant minister to make recommendations to the CEO. You say again you're asked whether or not an amendment. This is a very specific idea designed to achieve, well, I read it as a specific purpose. Who came up with this idea?
Mr Mookie, when we provide advice, we assess all of the different options, we put them forward. It's not for me to give views or opinions on the relative merits of them, but it is my job to put the available options on the table.
So that was your idea? Did you put that up?
I think I just outlined that I discussed Regulation 10A with the General Counsel of the Department of Premier and Cabinet at the time,
okay.
and then realistically, it's appropriate to put that question to the Public Service Commission in order to get their views, which count more than mine.
Look, again, can I just ask you, Investment New South Wales was a cluster agency within the DPC at the time, correct?
At that time it was, yes.
And so why was the department separately to Investment New South Wales engaging at this level? I mean, it's not routine for a general counsel of DPC, or at least to my knowledge it's not, to be weighing in at this level of specificity.
I think we've talked about what the advice was ultimately being used for, Mr. Mookie.
And incidentally, we'll move on to the next matter. That's all right. Mr. Carr, do you mind turning to page 14 of the tender bundle? As part of General Counsel, you made the point that you were involved in negotiating of contracts, correct? With stick appointments, or potential stick appointments?
Just to be clear, I come in very late in the process. I don't draft the contracts. Investment New South Wales engaged external lawyers to assist with that. I was typically brought in to explain to candidates as they were nearing the end of the process the terms of the contract if they had any questions. On occasion, I would assist with the final negotiations, but it wasn't that I was negotiating the contracts, I was assisting.
Okay, and you were providing assistance to Ms West in this period of time, correct? From 12 August onwards till about 27 September?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. I just want to turn to the events of Friday the 17th of September. Did you speak to Ms West on that day?
I did.
Was it in the form of a phone call or a
yes. Yep.
A phone call?
Yep.
And did she call you or did you call her?
I went back and tried to check this fact, Mr. Mookie, but I was unable to confirm that. But either way, we spoke, on the telephone.
And did she inform you at that point that the offer, the verbal offer that was made to her for the appointment had been withdrawn? Or that she was notified that there was a reasonable possibility that it was going to be withdrawn?
I think she had outlined the nature of her conversation with the CEO that had taken place earlier that day.
Yeah. Did you say that you were horrified to hear about the situation she was in and couldn't believe what was being proposed?
So I heard Ms West's evidence, and I've seen her, I think a plain English reading of her notes suggests that my actual comments were below. The summary at the top was her interpretation. That was not a word that I would have used. Okay. Did you say, therefore, that you were offered the job, had it signed off, and just waiting on the contract, and then this happens? So, again, part of that is incomplete, which is the part which refers to had it signed off, and I'm happy to speak to that, which is that Ms West was referring to the foreknoting brief that has come up, and I know that because while we were speaking, and that's how I know we spoke, while we were speaking at that time, I do have a text message from Ms West where she forwarded me the foreknoting brief, and the conversation was in relevance to that, not that the overall package was signed off or anything of that nature.
I agree. And look, to be fair, it's a fair point, but it's not really the point that I'm getting to. But do you recall that you said words to the effect of you were offered the job, had it signed off, and were just waiting on the contract, and then this happens?
I think in Mr Mookie, I suppose I have difficulty with this note in the sense that I was speaking with a colleague who was quite plainly in a situation where I felt the need to console her because she was on the receiving end of the vicissitudes of life, and I felt that it was open to me as a colleague, just at a human level, to give her some degree of comfort. And
clear, Mr. Carr, that's highly reasonable and understandable in the context that you were in too. Just to be very clear, there's no inferences being made about you.
So what I struggle with, I suppose, Mr. Mookie, when I see this, is that you will often, just again, in the interest of being collegiate, try to deal with people on a human level. And yes, I would have been saying words that were of comfort on that call. I believe that's in my nature. I believe that's who I am.
Of course, Mr. Carr, and I'm not disagreeing. But then, do you, in the same vein of providing collegiate support or pastoral support or basic human friendship. Do you recall saying, I know how it feels having worked globally, you uprating your family, your life to go to another country, and then you do this to you. If it was me, I would be bitterly disappointed.
I don't know what "then you do this to you" means, but I can say that if I had a role that I coveted and I went a long way through the process, I have no doubt that she felt the finish line was in sight. Any time a colleague comes up against disappointment, you would, of course, try to empathise and contextualise for yourself. I have moved countries, Mr. Mookie, multiple times, and I was empathising with the excitement the excitement and the enthusiasm that comes. And for somebody to be in a situation where, having gone through all of that and so close to the end, you find out that it's suddenly getting to a point where it's looking difficult, of course you try to relay your own experiences to that to give them some comfort. It's a perfectly, I would have thought, normal reaction.
Well to your character, Mr. Carr, just to be very clear.
Okay.
But we're just checking the accuracy, really.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that there are some inaccuracies, but I didn't outline them at the beginning because they go to a private conversation.
Basically, you did empathise with the situation she was in. At a human level.
At a human level? Of course.
Okay. I just want to turn to the next page of this, which I guess becomes a bit more material. Ms. West says that in this conversation, I also raised concerns about the relevant experience levels of a candidate the DP would put in. We asked her, Ms. West, whether she was making a reference to the Deputy Premier, and she said she was. She says that you went on to say Chris went on to explain that was why they were specifically called out trade and investment / biz experience in the job description. He asked for me to send relevant emails and paperwork, which I did. Do you recall Ms. West raising with you concerns about the relevant experience levels of a candidate the Deputy Premier would put in?
My recollection of the conversation is that Ms. West was sounding upset and frustrated, and so the prospect of her having raised those concerns, given that in the scenario you're talking about is that somebody else will get that job. I think as somebody who's applied for overseas jobs, you always think that you're best qualified and that any other candidate is not. I think she would have expressed some concern. The nature of my response, just to round that out, the nature of my response, I think is contested. I'm not sure that I would have spoken to the specificity of a job description because it was not really within the purview of my role.
Sure, but we'll get to that bit too, and to give you, Mr. Carr, a fair opportunity to account for that second part. But I just want to stay on the first part. Not out. Any person who misses out on a role may well, particularly in the circumstances in which Ms. West did, raise it. But at this point, she did actually say to you, or your recollection, the levels of experience levels of a candidate the Deputy Premier would put in. As in, she raised concerns specifically about an appointment by the Deputy Premier to the role.
I think, for context, Mr. Mookie, we were talking about converting these roles to ministerial appointments, and my understanding or my recollection is that whilst that is a reference to the Deputy Premier, he was also the relevant portfolio minister at the time.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. But just to be very clear, Ms. West did raise concerns with you about the Deputy Premier's involvement in that conversation.
Ms. West was, as I said, in a state that I would, she was obviously...
we don't necessarily...
I know, but what you have to understand is that I wasn't... The nature of this call was less about me being there to advise. I wasn't giving advice, wasn't doing anything like that. The nature of that call was effectively a person who was I felt was in a situation that I felt empathy for, and so therefore any comments she was making, any of my responses would have been taken with a grain of salt because it was in an environment where we had a person that was disappointed with where things were trajecting.
Mr. Carr, I don't dispute. Mr. Carr, I don't dispute that. I appreciate you saying you may not have put much weight on it, and that's fine. That's legitimate. But I'm just being very clear here because this is the part that's relevant directly to what we're inquiring into. But just to be clear here, Ms West did raise concerns about the Deputy Premier's involvement in that conversation with you, regardless of what you thought about it.
The way I took that comment, Mr Mookie, was more broadly around ministerial appointments. She was expressing an opinion based on a policy which I'm not here to express an opinion.
Can I just confirm, Chair, that the opposition are now being gifted the crossbenchers time? Is that correct? And they're taking all the crossbench time?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's all.
I think the second point that Mr Carr you were getting to was whether or not you went on to explain that that's why they would specifically called out trade and investment biz experience in the job description. You contest that?
I think what I'm saying is I would have provided some comfort to Ms West, but I don't think I was passing an opinion on the job descriptions or the role descriptions for these roles because it's not something I had purview of.
But to be clear here, the comments can be read in light of that. Was a part of your attempt to provide comfort to Ms West telling her that you were specifically calling out trade and investment business experience in the job description?
I'm not sure that I called it out or whether she called it out and I may have agreed or may have given her comfort to agree to it. It's, as you know, in conversations, sometimes people put things to you and you find a way to therefore support them by agreeing, and that may have been taken by her as me explaining that. I don't believe that.
Just before I pass to my colleague, did you keep any record of the conversation yourself?
Mr Mookie, firstly, this was not a conversation where I was called to give advice. I had a colleague who was upset, and it's not my usual practice when giving comfort and consolation to a colleague in a particular time. It's not my practice to use that as some sort of time to take notes and submit them later and file note them and say that this is an aspect that needs to be captured. There was nothing here that went to my professional responsibilities other than as a colleague. And frankly, I don't keep file notes, or I don't keep notes of circumstances where I'm consoling colleagues. It's just.
Just because I'm not making any inferences. It's just more a case of we've had one contaminated report produced, and it was just as a matter of fairness to ask you whether you had any other.
Okay, so Mr. Mookie, can I? This is the first time in my life, and I've supervised people, I've dealt with people in incredibly difficult scenarios. This is the first time in my life that I've ever had read back to me the contents of a conversation where I'm offering care and support and guidance to someone in a very difficult situation, and I can say it in and of itself has caused a degree of distress on me because you treat colleagues respectfully in my world and you approach them with that respect and dignity, and you do not normally expect them, when you offer a hand essentially of collegiality and a friendship, that they're going to be taking notes in response.
Questions, thank you. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, actually moving on really. Okay, sorry. I wanted to ask you some questions about the unwinding of the position from being the cabinet decision that basically wanted to convert those positions from public service positions to ministerial positions. It was the case that cabinet decided that these would, from in the future, and on or around 27th of September last year, that these would be now ministerial appointments. Is that correct?
Broadly speaking, yes.
And so so we've talked about, I don't want to revisit all of the sort of, once you became aware of that, how did you become aware of that? Did Ms Brown tell you?
I would have been informed of it more likely, I think, the next day, the 28th, somewhere in that order. If not from the secretary, then if not from the CEO, then from her chief of staff. And
what flowed from that then was action that you were then getting ready to prepare. Was whether it was regulations or legislation to actually enact that. Yeah.
Well, so yes, so. I think we've talked about that I was approached to join a call with the Deputy Premier's office, which never happened. In the interim, I also took the time.
So when was that call due to happen?
It was never arranged. I mean,
There was supposed to be a call.
there was supposed to be a call. Well, sorry, the two emails were very ephemeral in nature, as in we should talk about that decision. Can we have a call at some point? And it was either to be that week or the following week. As fate would have it, as people know, the Deputy Premier in that window had resigned, and so therefore the call never happened.
Yep. Okay. So what action did you take to start preparing legislation?
I very promptly took the steps of assessing what would actually be required, and this is there is a lot of detail that goes into this, which contributes to what is required. So I want to be very careful here, because the complete universe of what is required is relevant. So it's not just that you look at one bit and say that that's the relevance. So I took, on or about the 28th, I started the review of the Western Australian government's audit and review of their trade officers. I reviewed the Joyce report from the South Australian government. I also started the process of looking at the Trade and Investment Queensland Act and the Agent General and Commissioners for Victoria Act to get some guidance from other states. I found that the Western Australian audit report and review provided probably the best of all of that, of the colour of what are the options, because it's not a simple process. I then started the process of digesting what would be required in the light of the Investment New South Wales offshore structure. So a couple of the things that really matter here are that if you were to convert these to ministerial appointments via legislation, we were at risk, I think, in two markets at least that I can recall, one of which was the United States, of potential duplication and the cost of that, because you have a corporate structure that we were still seeking advice on, but the reality would be that making these ministerial appointments rather than Regulation 10A overseas trade employees created the very live question as to whether, in fact, our US structure should be set up as what's called a miscellaneous foreign government office. In order to do that, you'd require additional consideration, which is that you need to speak to the Commonwealth around how they would interact with the US State Department.
Is that the nature of the discussion you had with the junior trade minister in Barilaro's office around those kind of? Does that get to that point?
No.
Just in that timescale, you started that on the 28th of September?
I started a more in-depth review of what would be required. So it's not that we didn't think about it. Of course, we thought about it.
But the government made the decision, or the decision of government was made well before.
A decision of government can take all sorts of forms, but in terms of how you proactively and prospectively implement it, it was, of course, going to require significantly more work in order to deliver it.
The government decision was made on the 27th of September.
Or thereabouts, I believe.
We've had it confirmed. That decision took place despite all these considerations you were raising on the 28th, as in the Cabinet had already agreed at this point in time to convert these into ministerial appointments well before, the day before, you were turning your mind to these very detailed and complicated questions.
I was, Mr. Mookie, I think the evidence I was giving was that I was turning my mind to what would be the best methodology and best pathway to move forward to implement the decision of government. And there is more detail to this that needs to be considered as to
Before you get to that, can I just ask you this question, which is what time frame were you given by the government to establish legislative change for these positions?
I can't recall we were given a specific deadline by which we had to implement that.
I mean, the advice all the way along had been that there was some urgency to these appointments, and don't forget that there were several that had been in play that were then, they hadn't gone to offer, but they were basically in place. So you're saying that there wasn't a time frame.
I took the ongoing importance of the program to be evidence that we needed to move with haste in terms of preparing and understanding what that would look like. I felt at the time the advice that would have to have come later needed to be as comprehensive as possible, because frankly, we are talking about a program where I need to be mindful to ensure in markets that, not all markets are like the US. There are markets where our structure needs to be very carefully considered for the safety and welfare of all of our people, not just the sticks. And so I took it that there was a degree of haste in being required in all of this. That's why I started immediately to go back and really deeply think about what this would look like, overlaid on top of Investment New South Wales' structure. I had already formed the view that it would be possible to reach a solution, but you need to, from my perspective,
that's never been actioned, just to be clear, that's never been actioned.
Before we go and brief Parliamentary Counsel's office to draft up some legislation, we do need to have thought through. There were 3 limbs of concerns that we had. One was a New South Wales law concern to make sure that it was fully compliant. One was a Commonwealth law, as in, were we going to do something that somehow would fall us foul of the Commonwealth legislation? Because, in fairness to the Victorians, they implemented this under the Brumby government, and so we're talking about something that's come much later. And then we also had local law matters that we had to deal with separately. So we would have come up with something, I'm sure. I'm very confident of it, but we had not got there by the time that the intervening events that I think the Secretary has dealt with came along.
So just to be clear, so basically this was never progressed, but it did go to Cabinet to reverse. So Cabinet makes a decision that they're going to be ministerial appointments. At some point it goes to Cabinet again to say that the recruitment of these other sticks was going to proceed under the original process. Is that correct?
So my involvement in that aspect of it, Ms. Sharp, I don't have anything to add to the evidence that was given by the Secretary because I wasn't.
Well, I would like the time frame of when it went to Cabinet to reassert that these positions were going to be public service positions.
Because those relate to discussions that I wasn't part of, I think it's probably better asked to others.
Can I just confirm that, because you were involved in the contract negotiations of the Indo, Middle East and the ASEAN sticks, can I just confirm that they basically were appointed from the initial round and they weren't reopened?
I'm typically involved in the contract negotiations after the selection panel has done its work. I'm not, up until that point, I have no visibility. I have essentially no visibility on how that plays out, so I can't speak to that.
Carl, can you turn to page 25 of the tender bundle, please? I'm just going to pick up from the line of questioning that my colleague was asking you about how we go from having a Cabinet decision taken on the 27th to convert them to ministerial appointments, and then a reversal sometime 10 days after that or thereabouts. So this is the questions that we were asking Ms Brown. And if you see the first highlighted part of that section, you see here that I ask, we've now confirmed instructions to commence preparation of legislation. Who gave you those instructions? Then we go on to talk about the meetings that Ms Brown had with the Deputy Premier's office between the 27th of September and 1 October. I presume you were not at any of those meetings?
I was not at any of those meetings.
And did you have any discussion with Ms Brown about those meetings?
I may have. I have no specific recollections of meetings that she had with the Deputy Premier's office. I was busily preparing and trying to get my head very quickly across a very complex set of facts in order so that when I was asked what would legislation look like, how would we put this in place, what would be the cost, what would be the diversion of resources involved, I had to get my head around that very, very quickly. And so my focus in the window you're talking about, Mr Mookie, my focus would have been on those matters.
Sure, and look, Mr Card, to be fair here, you're not contradicting the Secretary by any means at this point in time. But you can see here, just down below, you can see here that I asked Ms Brown, you had discussions about the practicalities of preparing this legislation. When you meant to have the legislation prepared by? Ms Brown says we were not given a timeline. What information were you given about the practicalities that you were meant to meet? The instruction was to commence preparation of legislation, then it was up to us to work through all implications of that, come up with a timeline and the process. That's basically the process you were doing, correct? I
had started that work.
Yeah. Just if you go forward to the next page, you see here that I ask Ms Brown whether or not the government has reverted its position. And she goes that the government did not revert its position. And then I ask, are we still converting these to statutory officers? Ms Brown goes, I had a conversation with the incoming portfolio minister. I asked who that was. Ms Brown says it was Minister Stuart Ayres. And then she provides a bit of context there about the nature of that conversation. I presume you were not at the meeting with Ms Brown and Minister Ayres or in that conversation?
I was not part of that conversation.
Do you talk to Minister Ayres' office currently?
On occasion, I would say by contrast, sorry, take a step back. The Department of Enterprise and Trade has 4 ministers that we're accountable to. Minister Ayres is the leader.
Yep.
I would say that on balance, I have engagement with all of the ministerial officers on questions that require analysis from time to time, but I wouldn't characterise it as active or busy or it could be specific questions.
How often have you had requests come from Minister Ayres' office in respect to stick appointments of any type since he became the portfolio minister?
In relation to appointments, it's not something I would...
How about in general? About any matter to do with the stick?
To do with the stick appointments, not much.
What's that mean?
If at all, I'd need to go back and check.
Well, do you attend any weekly or fortnightly meetings with
No, I
Minister Ayres'
don't.
office? But those meetings take place, correct?
They could. I don't know. I don't attend them, and I'm not. I don't get minutes of them or anything like that. I don't get any readout unless a specific issue comes.
Do you get requests from Minister Ayres or his office to provide legal advice directly to them, or does it go through the department?
I think with Minister Ayres' office, on occasion, if a question can be expedited and raised with me, that they would reach out, the office would reach out and ask a question.
Is that a policy advisor or is it the chief of staff?
Normally it's a policy advisor.
How many requests have you had from Minister Ayres' office for quick legal advices that could be reached?
With respect, I came here prepared to talk about the appointment of John Barilaro.
That's what we're talking about.
No, but sorry, you just asked how many...
Yes, and I'm asking you
about
how
Mr.
often...
Barilaro's appointment.
You provided us with a very clear sense of the nature of your interactions with Minister Barilaro's office. Now I'm just wanting to understand what is the nature of your interactions with Minister Ayres' office.
I have had no interactions with Minister Ayres' office that go to how he was selected, how he was appointed, how he was recruited, or any of that sort of thing.
Or to any of the other trade commissioners?
Have I had any interactions with them about that?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I don't believe so.
So Ms Brown tells us that in some form of a conversation with Minister Ayres, which I think you can see, I pushed Ms Brown to sort of give us a time frame. I think the best we got to was sometime in the first week of him taking over the portfolio. He apparently makes the decision that the conversion isn't a priority, or at least in some form of a conversation with Ms Brown, that is the conclusion that they reach. Were you advised at that time that it was no longer a priority?
As to the exact time when I was advised of the outcome of that, I'd need to take that on notice to confirm, because I don't have that detail at my fingertips.
Okay, well, do you recall, was it sometime in October that you were told to...
I would expect so.
Okay, and who told you to cease work or delay or on the conversion of the ministerial appointments?
Well, in fairness, having just said that I need to confirm when I was told, I'd need to also confirm who told me.
Does the government want questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Mr Carr, I'm just having a look at some of the documents that have been tendered in the previous hearings and also part of the tender bundle that Mr Mookie's given you now. In relation to the contemporaneous notes that were tabled last week from Ms West, that detail the conversation that you had with her, I take it from the first paragraph that she's likely to have called you and you weren't aware at all of the conversation that she and the CEO were having that morning.
I don't think it's correct to say that I wasn't aware that they were going to have a conversation. I think the evidence that's been put forward shows that Ms West was sort of calling around or messaging around in relation to her contract.
Yes. And I think that's where I'm sort of going with the line of questioning. I assume that she contacted you, and there's the contemporaneous notes. Do you know if any other people that she may have spoken with in the organisation on that day?
She would have spoken to the Investment New South Wales CEO's Chief of Staff on that day. I think my recollections of the conversation not captured in her notes, but I think she was looking for something to be signed. So she would have been calling around to people. I don't know. Other than that, I know that she would have tried to call the Chief of Staff because I had indicated that some of the matters that she'd raised, I didn't know for sure, and so therefore I would be checking, as is my right.
Is it fair to say that you weren't aware that she would be keeping contemporaneous notes of the conversation?
I think, my previous answer on this is clear. It is the first time I've dealt with a lot of people in a lot of different places, and I've helped people through some oftentimes very difficult circumstances, and this is the first time in giving someone consolation that they have taken contemporaneous notes of my conversation.
Because I note that in part of the tender bundle that she gave to us last week, that at 7 a.m. She had taken contemporaneous notes of the walk that she'd taken with the CEO of Investment New South Wales. So it would be my contention that that note was probably taken after the conversation. It was taken before the conversation that you had. So she didn't indicate at all to you in your conversation that she would be making this note as well. Given that I believe that she would have already made the contemporaneous note about the previous conversation, and she didn't indicate to you that she was making the contemporaneous note about your conversation.
She gave me no indication that she was taking notes of our conversation.
Okay. And I think you've already answered the question, but I just want to be clear about it. The experience that you've had when you've given pastoral care or friendship to a colleague who has had a difficult decision made against them, or a decision go against them, you've never experienced somebody making contemporaneous notes of this nature about that conversation.
That has never been my experience in life that's happened.
And was it made clear, do you believe, that the conversation was one of friendship, or was it one of advice from you in your role as the head of legal?
I was not. The nature of that call was not advisory.
Right.
It wasn't.
No. So, would it be unfair to then, in your opinion, rely on the notes that and the comments that were made in this contemporaneous note in relation to the events?
Look, that is for others to comment on, I think.
Let me be more clear. Do you believe that this is 100% accurate of the conversation that you had at the time, or do you believe there are potentially inaccuracies?
Well, no, I've spoken to some inaccuracies in parts where it's clearly in shorthand. Also, as I said, the outset of this note is clearly her assessment of the call, not in relation to my comments.
Yeah.
She's made reference to some comments. I think Mr. Mookie in fairness, gave me a good opportunity to talk to aspects that were missing. There are aspects that are missing. It is for other people to determine whether it's fair or otherwise.
When, in your experience, for people that do make contemporaneous notes of conversations, do people typically keep note of all parts of the conversation, or do they perhaps put a selective lens over the bits that they retain, obviously omitting parts that perhaps aren't beneficial to the cause that they are seeking to progress?
I think my experience with people's note-taking, and probably my experience with my own note-taking, frankly, is that there are people who take very comprehensive notes, there are people who don't, and there are people who will take notes for selected purposes, and there are people who don't. As to Ms. West's intentions in taking these notes, that's a comment for her. That's a question for her.
Okay. I'll move on to what may have been part of that intention. You note in your correspondence that you received, your opening statement, you note you received correspondence from their lawyers, and I'm just confirming the date was, I think, the 14th the 19th of October 2021, is that correct?
Yep.
Was that correspondence from her lawyers seeking information or elucidations about the role, or was it seeking more a compensatory position that Investment New South Wales somehow compensate Ms West for what had occurred?
So the letters that we received, I want to be very careful to, because they go to correspondence that we received in an environment where I believe the correspondence is captured by without prejudice privilege, so litigation privilege, and so therefore I don't want to speak to the matters that were covered in that correspondence, in fairness.
Okay. No, that's fair enough, and I won't push that point. Are you able at all to indicate, however, whether there was a conclusion to those matters, i.e., was there a finality brought to that action brought by Ms West against Investment New South Wales?
I think
Action.
Okay.
Did she actually bring an action? That's the other question.
Well, I guess
That's the first question. Did she bring an action?
that's my question. Did she bring? Yes. Did she bring a question? Did she bring an action? Was it resolved?
well, bringing an action is something that would appear on the public record, and I think people can check. I don't believe that she brought an action.
Are you able to detail to us if she received any compensation at all from Investment New South Wales?
I have nothing to contest her evidence on this, which is that she was paid her entitlements. The only addition I would make is that she was entitled to some leave, like the balance of her leave as well, which she didn't cover, but I don't know what the details of that are. That would be confidential to her and people and culture.
But all the payments that she detailed in her evidence were only related to her role being taken.
Redundant.
Made redundant. Made redundant. Yeah. So the is that so that there was no further payments to that?
Sorry. Yes. That's my understanding.
Okay. Can we just turn to, and I know I've only got a very little bit of time left, the conversation that we've had in this inquiry so far has been around the conversion of what were effectively public sector appointments to ministerial appointments. The process with which Mr. Barilaro underwent in order to be offered the role of the Trade Commissioner for the Americas was not a ministerial appointment. It was a public service appointment process. Was it as rigorous as the process previously? Are you able to provide some insight into that?
When you come in after a panel process simply to help a candidate understand the terms of a contract, it really is not the purview of the General Counsel of a department or an agency. Typically, public service appointments, contracts don't even come through legal. They're handled as a fairly standard formatter, even at that level of seniority. This is unusual because there is the need to explain to candidates, even those that are within the public sector or coming from the private sector, as to what, or in response to their questions as to around why things are done that way, as to the rigours of the recruitment process that got up to that point. I mean, I was only aware in relation to Mr. Barilaro as and when I was asked to have that conversation with him. I hadn't had any oversight of the rest of it. It's not within my purview.
Okay. I'll rephrase that question then, perhaps in without seeking an opinion, but more, I guess, on a factual basis. It wasn't a ministerial appointment. It was a recruitment process that required the candidates to undergo a number of recruitment steps. Is that correct?
My understanding in relation to the process for Mr. Barilaro is that, yes, there would have been those steps. There'd be a plethora of checks that get done, but I think those have been detailed by others, and I think they're best managed.
Can I just clarify one thing directly on this? Can I just clarify that your understanding of the government position in relation to the stick appointments is that they are to be ministerial appointments? That is still a position that stands.
So
it hasn't been actioned, but that is the government position in relation to these positions.
I think that that's a matter for government to confirm. I don't.
Don't you need to know as the legal counsel?
I can only comment on contracts that comply with the.
No, well, that's not true. You've just done.
A point of order, Chair. I mean, the witness has answered that question, and it is my time.
Well,
and
you've
had more than an hour and a half, effectively, to question the witness, and now I'm just seeking some elucidations from the witness from the evidence before we run out of time.
Perhaps you can take that on notice, Mr. Carr.
Well, no. If you've had plenty of time to have asked him that in the time that you had. You can put it on.
The more you argue this, Mr. Fang, the less time you've got.
Yes, but I seem to have to continue to argue the time. Mr. Carr, in relation to the positions not being ministerial appointments, any contention that anybody in the government was, I guess, effectively aiming to gift the role is not possible, given that there was a number of people, including the Public Service Commissioner and independent members, as part of that interview panel. Would that be a fair thing to say, that there was so many independent components to that recruitment process, which wasn't a ministerial appointment, that it would have made it extremely hard for it to be gifted to anybody?
I can only speak to the parts of the process that I actually saw in relation to Mr. John Barilaro, and for me that was that a selection process was undertaken. A contract was to be prepared and finalised with him. I was to make myself available, as I had done with other stick appointments, in order to explain any questions that he may have had of a contractual nature. I wasn't there, and it's not typical, I think, for a general counsel to be overseeing what is essentially a people and culture process, or essentially a process that's handled by the panels. I note your comment about who was on that panel. That's a matter of record. I don't have any observations. It's not appropriate for me to give observations on those individuals. I think they were eminently qualified, but that's just a personal view. It's not my view as to the appropriateness or whatnot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. My time has expired, and thank you very much for making yourself available today.
Okay. We have one question?
Yeah, I've just got one question. Thank you, Mr. Carr. Can I just take you back to the 6th of September or the 9th of September, when you were first contacted to provide advice? You were new. You hadn't been in the role very long, General Counsel. You're requested to provide some legal advice. Who asked you for the legal advice?
I think my earlier evidence went to that it was either the Investment New South Wales CEO or her Chief of Staff.
That's right. So all I'm asking is, when you are asked as General Counsel, is it not one of the most important first questions of any lawyer to document who is requesting the advice and who that request has come from? And can you just try a little bit harder to remember who it might have been? So
to be clear, when I get instructions from the Chief of Staff, I take them to be from the Investment New South Wales CEO. I take them to be, it's the office of the CEO anyway. I think it's, as to the specifics of who called who and when, as I said, I really do wish that our phones would keep better memories of these things. But
and you don't think you file noted so and so requested this advice?
I think the advice would have, and the advice was turned around in short order. the advice would have noted, I suspect, who had made, lawyers, as you appreciate, lawyers love to use the words like you and we and whatnot.
I'm a lawyer, and every time I
so-
requested advice, I write who has requested it.
Okay,
It's the first point of all
in
business.
in responding on that advice, which would have gone back, as I said, to the Investment New South Wales CEO, and possibly copying her chief of staff, which I think was my earlier evidence, it would have said something along the lines of you have requested, or as per your request, or something along those lines. It would have gone back on that basis. That's pretty much standard practice for lawyers to respond in that nature.
All right, thank you, Mr Carr. Your time for questioning has ended. I note you've taken a number of questions on notice, in fact, a large number of them. The Secretary will be in contact with you within 21 days of receipt of the transcript, and we'd appreciate it if you would promptly respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
for coming.
Thank you.